A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. You know, Herman, I was looking at some old crime thrillers the other day, and you always see that one classic shot. There is a beat-up van parked across the street. The side door slides open just an inch, and you see this massive gray telephoto lens poking out. It usually clicks away with a very audible shutter sound, and then we cut to a grainy black and white photo of a guy handing over a briefcase.
It's the ultimate surveillance trope, Corn. The long lens in the dark. Aesthetic. But honestly, if a modern detective showed up to court with a grainy, unverified photo like that in 2026, a halfway decent defense attorney would have it thrown out before the bailiff finished saying, "All rise."
That is exactly where my head is at. We have reached a point where seeing is believing is legally dead. If I can generate a photo of you stealing a car using a prompt on my phone in 10 seconds, how does a jury know a surveillance photo is real? Today's prompt from Daniel hits on this perfectly. He wants us to dig into the specialized gear law enforcement actually uses, specifically the forensic grade stuff from Sony, and how they are fighting back against the "it is just AI" defense.
It is a fascinating pivot in the industry. We are moving from the era of capture to the era of provenance. And just so everyone knows, today's deep dive is actually powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash, which is fitting since we are talking about the intersection of high-end hardware and AI-generated reality.
Ermin Poppleberry, I know you have been scouring the technical manuals for Sony's industrial line. Before we get into the spy stuff, let's clear the air. When Daniel mentions forensic grade cameras, is he just talking about a really expensive Alpha 7 with a police sticker on it? Or are we looking at fundamentally different internals?
It is a bit of both, but the industrial side is where it gets weird. Most people know Sony for their alpha cameras, the ones wedding photographers and YouTubers use. And yes, plenty of detectives use an Alpha 7R5 because 61 megapixels gives you a lot of room to crop. But Sony also has this industrial and PTZ division that makes things like the ILX-LR1.
I saw a picture of that thing. It looks like a Borg cube. No screen, no buttons, no battery grip. Just a sensor in a box. It's almost unsettling how industrial it looks, like it wasn't even meant for human hands to hold.
That is precisely the point. It is a 61 megapixel full-frame sensor designed to be bolted inside a car dashboard, hidden in a utility box on a pole, or mounted to a high-end drone. It is stripped of everything a photographer needs and replaced with things a surveillance team needs, specifically the Sony Camera Remote SDK. This allows a team sitting in an office 3 blocks away to have total control over focus, zoom, and exposure over a wired or encrypted wireless connection. They aren't sitting in the dark car anymore, the camera is in the car, and they are in a Starbucks with a tablet.
But wait, if they are controlling it remotely via a tablet, isn't there a massive lag? I mean, if I'm trying to snap a photo of a handoff and the Wi-Fi blips, I miss the shot. How do they handle the latency in a high-stakes environment?
That's where the industrial part of the SDK comes in. These aren't using your standard home Wi-Fi protocols. They often use dedicated point-to-point microwave links or hardened 5G modules. Sony's API allows for low latency monitoring, meaning the detective sees a low-res, high-speed stream to frame the shot, but the camera is simultaneously buffering the raw, full-resolution data locally. Even if the connection drops for a second, the camera keeps recording the evidence internally.
So the dark car is now just an unmanned mobile hotspot with a high-end lens. That makes sense. But let's talk about the image quality. If I am a cop and I am trying to identify a face at 200 meters in the middle of the night, what is the hardware doing differently than my high-end smartphone or a standard DSLR?
This is where we get into the weeds of sensor design. Most consumer cameras use a rolling shutter. When the sensor reads the data, it goes line by line. If a car is driving by fast, you get that jello effect where everything looks slanted. In a forensic context, that could be argued as image distortion. Sony's forensic-focused models, like some of the specialized SNC series, often prioritize global shutters or extremely fast readout speeds to eliminate those artifacts.
I've actually seen that jello effect on my phone when I try to take a video out of a train window. The telephone poles look like they're leaning at a 45-degree angle. If you're trying to prove a car was speeding, or identify a specific rim on a tire, that distortion could be a nightmare in a deposition, couldn't it?
A defense expert would look at that leaning car and argue that the entire geometry of the scene is unreliable. If the car is leaning, how do we know the driver's face isn't stretched? By using a global shutter, where every pixel on the sensor captures light at the exact same microsecond. Sony removes that line of questioning entirely. What you see is geometrically perfect, which is a huge deal for forensic photogrammetry.
And the light! Daniel mentioned night acquisition. I assume they aren't using a giant flash and giving away their position.
Hardly. They lean heavily on XMOR-R sensors, which are back illuminated. In a traditional sensor, the wiring sits in front of the light-gathering photodiodes. In an XMOR-R, they flip it. The light hits the diodes directly. It sounds simple, but it significantly improves what we call the signal-to-noise ratio. You can crank the ISO to 64,000 or higher, and while a consumer photo might look like a bowl of digital oatmeal, the forensic sensor is tuned to keep the edges sharp enough for facial recognition software to grab a mathematical map of the features.
I noticed some of these specialized Sony units, like the SNC VM632R, which is a mouthful boast, a minimum illumination of 0.008 lux. Just for context, a moonless clear night sky is usually around 0.001 lux. So we are talking about seeing in conditions where a human would be tripping over their own feet.
It is effectively starlight photography, and they often pair these sensors with IR-cut filters that are mechanical. During the day, the filter blocks infrared light so the colors look natural. At night, the camera physically moves that filter out of the way, turning the camera into an infrared beast. If the police have an invisible IR illuminator nearby, basically a flashlight that humans can't see, the camera sees the scene as if it is broad daylight, just in black and white.
Wait, I've seen those ring lights on security cameras that glow a faint red. Is that what you mean? Because that seems like it would still give away the camera's location if someone looked right at it.
Those are usually 850 nanometer LEDs, which do have that visible red glow. But the high-end forensic stuff often uses 940 nanometer illuminators. At that wavelength, the light is completely invisible to the human eye. You could be standing 3 feet away from a floodlight and you wouldn't see a thing, but the Sony sensor sees the world as if it's high noon. It's like having a superpower that only works in the digital realm.
Okay, let's get to the AI defense part, because this is the most 2026 problem I have ever heard of. If I am a defense lawyer, my first move now is to say, Your Honor, this photo of my client was clearly hallucinated by a generative model trained on police data. How does a Sony camera prove it is not a liar?
This is really the heart of Daniel's prompt. Sony has been a leader in the C2PA, that is the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. They have started baking something called in-camera digital signatures into the firmware of their professional and industrial lines.
Like a digital wax seal?
The moment the photons hit the sensor and the image is processed into a file, the camera's hardware security module generates a cryptographic hash. It takes the image data, the metadata like the GPS coordinates, the exact time from a synchronized network clock, and the camera's unique serial number, and signs it with a private key that lives inside the camera's silicon.
So if I take that photo into Photoshop and just nudge the guy's hand 2 inches to make it look like he is holding a gun, what happens?
The hash breaks. It is a binary state of truth. When the prosecution presents the file in court, they run it through a validation tool. If even 1 pixel has been altered, or if the metadata has been stripped, the signature fails. Sony actually just updated this for video too, the version 2026.1 firmware. Proving a still photo is real is hard enough, but proving a 10-minute video hasn't been deepfaked is the new frontier. This firmware creates a continuous chain of authenticity for the entire video stream.
But how does that handle the in-between steps? Like, if the detective has to export the video to a thumb drive, or if it gets uploaded to a cloud server, does the signature stay with the file? Or is it like a physical seal that breaks as soon as you move the box?
It's more like a DNA sequence that's woven into the file itself. As long as the file format supports the C2PA manifest, the signature travels with it. If you move it from an SD card to a server, the manifest stays intact. The only way to break it is to change the actual data of the image. Even resizing the image or changing the brightness in a way that alters the pixel values will invalidate that specific signature. Sony's system actually creates a parent-child relationship. If a forensic analyst needs to brighten the image to see a face, they can do so, but the software creates a new signed version that points back to the original untouched file. You can see the entire history of what was done to that image.
It is wild that we have reached a point where the chain of custody doesn't start when the detective bags the SD card. It starts at the literal moment the light hits the sensor. If you don't have that birth certificate for the image, it is basically gossip.
And it's working. There was a landmark case in California just a few months ago, a murder trial where the primary evidence was a surveillance clip from a high-mounted Sony unit. The defense brought in an AI expert who testified that the suspect's face showed signs of consistent GAN-style artifacts, basically claiming it was a deepfake. The prosecution brought in a forensic technician who demonstrated the C2PA cryptographic seal was intact from the moment of capture. The judge ruled the footage authentic. Without that hardware-level signature, that case might have ended in a hung jury or an acquittal.
That is a massive shift. It makes me wonder about the lenses, though. Daniel asked if they differ from what we use. I mean, I love a good telephoto lens for taking pictures of birds, but I'm usually looking for that creamy bokeh, where the background is all blurry and pretty. I'm guessing a cop doesn't care about artistic background blur.
They actually hate it. If you are a detective and you take a photo of a suspect, but the street sign behind him or the license plate next to him is a blurry mess because you are shooting at f2.8 to get more light, you have failed. You need depth of field.
So they want the opposite of what every pro photographer wants. They want everything in focus, from 10 meters to 100 meters.
Right, so they use these extreme super zooms. Think of the Sony 200 to 600 millimeter G lens. It is huge, it is heavy, but it is incredibly sharp. But more importantly, law enforcement often uses PTZ systems, pan-tilt zoom, that have 30 times or even 40 times optical zoom. These lenses are designed for flat field sharpness. They use fluorite elements and extra low dispersion glass, ED glass, to make sure there is no chromatic aberration.
Translate that for the non-nerds, Herman.
Chromatic aberration is that purple or green fringing you see around dark objects against a bright sky. In a surveillance photo, that fringing can obscure small details like the numbers on a house or the fine print on a document someone is holding. These forensic lenses are over-engineered to keep those edges perfectly clean. They aren't trying to make a beautiful image, they're trying to make a legible image.
I've seen some of those 30 times optical zoom demos. It is actually terrifying. You can be standing on a balcony across a parking lot and literally read the text messages on someone's phone screen.
And because it is optical zoom, not digital, you aren't losing resolution. You are putting all 61 megapixels of that full-frame sensor onto that tiny phone screen. That is the difference. Your iPhone might say 100 times zoom, but it is just cropping and using AI to guess what the pixels should look like. In court, guessing is a disaster. A defense attorney will eat AI upscaling for breakfast. They want raw, optical, glass-resolved detail.
Speaking of guessing, what about the autofocus? If you're zoomed in that far, the tiniest movement, like a person breathing, could throw the focus off. Does Sony use that real-time IAF that I see in their commercials?
They do, but it's tuned differently. In an alpha camera, the AF is looking for a pleasing focus on the eye. In the forensic units, the AI processing chip is looking for persistent object tracking. It doesn't just look for eyes, it looks for human silhouettes, vehicle types, and even specific colors. If a suspect walks behind a tree, the camera uses pose estimation to predict where they will emerge and keeps the focus plane locked on that exact distance. It's less about making a pretty portrait and more about sticky tracking that doesn't let go, even in a crowded environment.
This brings up a funny point about the AI defense. If the police use AI to improve a grainy photo like using a denoiser or a sharpener, does that also break the digital signature?
Yes, and that is the big dilemma for law enforcement right now. For years, they use tools to enhance footage. Now, if you enhance it, you might be destroying its admissibility. The trend is moving toward darker but honest images. Forensic teams would rather have a dark, slightly noisy photo that they can prove is untouched than a bright, clean photo that has been touched by an algorithm.
It's the organic movement, but for surveillance. No additives, no preservatives, just raw photons. But Herman, doesn't that make the job harder? If the photo is too dark for the jury to see, what good is it?
Well, that's where the high dynamic range of the sensor comes in. These Sony sensors can capture 15 or 16 stops of dynamic range. So while this display might look dark, the data's is all there. The prosecution can take that signed raw file into court and show the jury, here is the original. Now we are going to apply a simple linear gain, which is just like turning up the volume on a radio to show you the face. Since a linear gain doesn't invent new pixels like AI upscaling does, it's much easier to defend as a legitimate viewing aid rather than a manipulation.
It's like the difference between turning up the lights in a room versus painting a new face over the old one.
And Sony's partnership with FLIR back in 2023 really pushed this further. They started integrating thermal overlays, so you have a high-res visible light sensor and a thermal sensor working in tandem. The camera can see the heat signature of a person hiding in a bush, and then the software overlays that heat map onto the high-res 4K visible image. It gives the detectives the best of both worlds, detection and identification.
Let's talk about the hardware setup for a second. Daniel mentioned the dark car trope. If they aren't using DSLRs at the window as much, what is the rig now? Is it just a bunch of sensors hidden in the trim of a Ford Explorer?
It is becoming very integrated. Sony's PTZ cameras are often mounted in what they call low-profile housings. They can look like a standard roof rack or even a vent on a utility van. Because they can be controlled remotely via the SDK we mentioned, the crew can be anywhere. But the real pro move now is the drone integration. Using that ILX-LR1 camera on a gimbal, you can hover a drone at 400 feet high enough that it is just a quiet hum you wouldn't notice. And with a high zoom lens, you have a literal eye in the sky that can see what someone is doing in their backyard from 3 blocks away.
And again, if that drone is shaking in the wind, the forensic-grade optical image stabilization has to be top tier. I mean, 400 feet up with a 600mm lens. Every tiny vibration from the rotors must look like an earthquake on the sensor.
It's a different league of stabilization. Consumer cameras use a mix of optical and electronic stabilization. Electronic stabilization crops the image and shifts it around to smooth things out. But again, cropping and shifting can be argued as manipulating the frame in court. So these forensic units rely on heavy-duty physical gimbals and lens-based stabilization that doesn't mess with the actual pixel map of the sensor. Sony actually uses gyro sensors that sample at thousands of times per second to counteract the drone's vibration before the light even hits the glass.
It's amazing how much courtroom anxiety dictates the engineering of these things. Every single design choice, from the sensor readout to the glass to the metadata, is built to survive a cross-examination.
It really is. Even the way the files are saved is different. Sony uses a proprietary forensic video format in some of these units that includes tamper-evident wrappers. It is not just an MP4 file you can open in VLC. It requires a specific viewer that checks the integrity of the stream every second. If there is a drop in the frames or a mismatch in the metadata, the player flags it immediately.
Does that mean the police can't even edit the footage for a press release? Like, if they want to blur out a bystander's face, does that break the evidence?
For the version they show the public, they can edit it all they want, but the master evidence file remains untouched. Sony's software allows for non-destructive blurring, where the blur is just an instruction layer on top of the video, rather than a permanent change to the pixels. In court, they can literally toggle the blur off to prove what was underneath it. It's all about maintaining that unbroken original.
So, for the photography enthusiasts listening, the people who maybe have a Sony Alpha at home, what is the takeaway here? Should we be jealous of the cop gear, or is it actually kind of miserable to use for anything else?
Oh, you would hate it for a vacation. Imagine a camera that refuses to let you edit the photos, has no screen, weighs 5 pounds, and produces images that look clinical rather than pretty. The industrial line is built for a very narrow, high-stakes purpose. However, the technology does trickle down. The back illuminated sensors we all enjoy in our mirrorless cameras were basically perfected for surveillance and industrial inspection first.
And the in-camera authenticity thing. I bet that becomes a standard feature for everyone in the next few years. Not just for cops, but for journalists, or even just regular people who want to prove a photo hasn't been beautified or altered. I can see a world where social media apps have a verified capture badge that only lights up if the C2PA signature is present.
I think you are right. We are entering the authenticity wars. As AI gets better at faking reality, the hardware companies are going to lean harder into being the arbiters of truth. Sony is just the first one to really weaponize that for the law enforcement market. It's a smart move. They aren't just selling a camera, they are selling certainty.
It's a bit of an arms race. On one side, you have generative models getting scarily good at creating surveillance-style, fake images. On the other, you have Sony engineers building cryptographic fortresses around every pixel.
And don't forget the optical side of that race. Lenses are getting smaller and more powerful. We are seeing folded optics and metalenses starting to appear in research papers. Lenses that don't use thick glass, but rather nanostructures to bend light. Imagine a surveillance camera the size of a button that has the zoom power of that massive 200 to 600 millimeter lens.
That is the stuff of nightmares, Herman. A button that can see your thumbprint from across the street. Is that actually on the horizon, or is that 2050 tech?
Sony is already experimenting with curved sensors, which allow for much smaller, simpler lens designs while maintaining edge-to-edge sharpness. It's not quite button size yet for full-frame quality, but the gap is closing. In 10 years, the idea of a long lens might be as obsolete as the grainy photo is today.
I think we have covered the hardware pretty well, but I want to circle back to the night acquisition part one more time. You mentioned IR illuminators. I remember reading about near-infrared versus shortwave infrared, or SWIR. Does Sony play in that space too?
They do, but SWIR is the heavy artillery. Standard night vision, what you see in most security cameras, is near infrared. It is great, but it can't see through fog, smoke, or certain types of glass. SWIR can. Sony released a sensor a couple of years ago called the SENSWIR, SENSWIR. It uses indium gallium arsenide instead of just silicon.
Indium gallium arsenide. Sounds like something you'd find in a crashed UFO.
It's basically a semiconductor that is sensitive to much longer wavelengths. It allows a camera to see through a heavy rainstorm or even see bruising under the skin or moisture levels in plants. In a law enforcement context, a SWIR camera can see through a tinted car window that looks pitch black to a normal camera.
Wait, so the tinted windows defense doesn't work anymore?
If they are using a SWIR-equipped Sony unit, no. The light at those wavelengths just passes right through the tint. You can see who is driving, what they are holding, and even if they have a seatbelt on, all while the car looks like a blacked-out limo to the naked eye. It's actually been used in high-value target surveillance, where the suspect thinks they are invisible behind 5% limo tint. The Sony sensor just ignores the tint entirely.
That is a game changer for highway patrol and surveillance. It really feels like the tech is stripping away every possible place to hide. Between the 61 megapixel Borg Cube cameras, the 30 times optical zooms that can read your mail, and the SWIR sensors that see through tinted glass, it's a lot.
It is. And it all funnels back into that court-admissible file. That is the thing to remember. None of this matters if you can't prove it in front of a jury. The engineering isn't just about seeing anymore, it is about attesting.
Do you think there will ever be a counter-tech? Like, if I'm a criminal, am I going to start wearing anti-infrared face paint or something?
People are already trying. There are privacy glasses that use IR reflecting frames to create a bright glare that blinds the camera. But that's why Sony uses multispectral setups. If you blind the IR sensor, the visible light sensor or the thermal sensor still has you. It's very hard to hide from 3 different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum at once.
Well, I think we have thoroughly deconstructed the modern dark car setup. It is less about a guy with a camera and more about a network of cryptographically secured sensors that can see through your windows and verify your identity via a digital wax seal.
Precisely. It's a brave new world for evidence. And honestly, it makes me want to go back and watch those old movies just to laugh at the grainy photo scenes. They had it so easy back then. The drama was all in the click of the shutter. Now the drama is in the validation of the hash.
Enhance. Enhance. Sir, we can't enhance it. The C2PA signature will break and we'll lose the case.
That's the real sequel, CSI Cryptography.
All right, let's wrap this up with some practical takeaways. If you're a photography buff, don't go trying to buy an ILX LR1 for your kid's soccer game. You will hate it. It doesn't even have a shutter button. You have to trigger it via a command line or a specialized remote.
And if you are interested in the surveillance side, look into global shutter sensors. They are becoming more common in high-end consumer cameras like the Sony A9 III. It's the tech that eliminates motion distortion, and it is a blast for sports and wildlife photography too. It's the closest you can get to forensic grade without needing a badge.
Just don't use it to read people's text messages from across the parking lot. That is a bit weird prompt even for us.
Fair point. Stick to the birds and the athletes.
This has been a great dive. Thanks to Daniel for the prompt. Always love the technical deep dives into how the world actually works behind the scenes. And a big thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flemingtop, for keeping the gears turning.
And we have to thank Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. We couldn't do these deep dives without that horsepower. It takes a lot of compute to simulate my technical pedantry.
If you enjoyed this episode, do us a favor and leave a review on whatever podcast app you're using. It really does help other people find the show. This has been my Weird Prompts. I'm Corn.
And I'm Herman Poppleberry. We will see you in the next one.
Stay authentic, folks.
And keep your pixels signed.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my weird prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flows from slow